This morning I preached about Ruth, the immigrant Moabitess. I covered the first half of her story. Before moving on to the second half, I'll give a brief recap on what's happened so far, particularly for the benefit of anyone that perhaps wasn't here this morning. Chapter 1 opened with an Israelite family in Bethlehem. Elimelech, Naomi, and their sons Mahlon and Chilion, struggling to survive a famine. In search of food, they moved to the neighboring land of Moab, where Mahlon and Chilion marry Moabite women. And for unknown reasons, Elimelech and his two sons die. And the Bible doesn't say what happened to them. And grief-stricken with no reason to stay, Naomi tells her daughters-in-law, Orpah and Ruth, that she's going back home to Israel. She knows the life of a foreign widow will be unbearably hard for them. So she compels them to return to their families in Moab and to remarry, to have children. However, Ruth insists on remaining with her mother-in-law. And the two of them make the long journey back to Israel, back to Bethlehem. At the end of the chapter, Naomi blames God for everything that's happened to her. Chapter 2 begins with Naomi and Ruth discussing where to find food. Food is actually quite a major theme in the book of Ruth. I'm not going to elaborate on it, but I'm sure there's probably quite a lot of things you could say about it. But here again, food. One of the necessities of life, and they're wondering, well, where are we going to get it from? How are we going to survive now we're here in Bethlehem? Ruth offers to go out and glean barley from the harvest fields. And without realizing it, she begins this risky task in a field belonging to Naomi's relative, a man called Boaz. Having noticed Ruth working in his field, Boaz finds out who she is, then engages her in conversation. And this results in Boaz making special provision for Ruth. And after Ruth comes home that day, Naomi is thrilled to find out that she met Boaz, because he is a close family relative who could potentially, at least she thinks, provide for them. And even maybe secure their assets, the assets that once belonged to Naomi's dead husband, Elimelech. He was once a landowner in Bethlehem. And by the end of the chapter, Naomi's faith in God is restored. And for the first time since the devastating deaths of her husband and sons, she glimpses the light of hope and realizes that God hasn't abandoned her, but has been there all along, showing his hesed, his steadfast love, his kindness through Ruth. At the end of the second chapter of Ruth, speaking of God, Naomi says, he has not stopped showing his kindness, his hesed, to the living and the dead. It's a statement that marks a dramatic turning point for Naomi. It's the moment when her faith in God is restored. She realizes that God's love has always been with her, even and perhaps especially in the midst of tragedy. Through Ruth's self-sacrifice, Naomi rediscovers God's hesed, his perfect love. And this then inspires her to love. She inclines her heart towards her daughter-in-law, towards Ruth, and starts thinking about her needs. The Apostle John wrote, "We love because he first loved us." We love because he first loved us. All Naomi wants at this point is to see her daughter-in-law safe and secure under the protective umbrella of a good man like Boaz. And I know as I say these things, I'm thinking it's a little bit cringy because this was a patriarchal society where it was, where things were very, very different. And society was structured completely differently. Naomi's hope is that family relations will incline Boaz to see past Ruth's low marriage prospects. She's an immigrant with no social connections or wealth whatsoever, at least in Israel. And not only that, but there's some uncertainty about whether or not she can have children. She never had any children while she was married to her first husband, Mahlon. With no male go-between to negotiate a marriage, so the male had to officiate everything. It was without a male in the family, you were in. Life was going to be difficult for you. So with no male go-between, no one to negotiate a marriage, Naomi devises a scheme that's fraught with risk. She sends Ruth out alone. This does seem like a slightly desperate move, and I suppose it was. She sends Ruth out alone in the night to the threshing floor celebration. And I'll explain what that is in a second. She's bathed, she's perfumed, she's wearing her best clothes, which are probably the clothes she was standing in, but maybe she was standing in, but she, probably only had one set of clothes at this point, but she probably cleaned them and made them look presentable. And she goes out to signal her readiness for marriage. Now, the threshing floor was where harvesters separated valuable grain from useless chaff, from the husks that would just be blown into the wind and got and lost. And once harvest was over, the threshing floor became the site of a great celebration. The harvest's been gathered in. Let's celebrate, let's eat, let's drink, let's be merry. Now, threshing floor celebrations had a reputation for drunkenness and for immorality. And for this reason, Naomi instructs Ruth to remain hidden until Boaz has finished eating and drinking. There's no suggestion, by the way, that Boaz is being immoral at all. Once Boaz has retired for the night and fallen asleep, Ruth is to quietly go to him. Make sure she's not seen by anybody else. Uncover his feet, lie down next to them, and wait. Wait for him to tell her what to do next. Now, the unusual actions Naomi instructs Ruth to take, they're intended to be a marriage proposal. It's a very strange, very elaborate marriage proposal. Or at least, look, I'm available. And if you say yes, I'm here, and I'm willing to marry you. And the benefit of doing this quietly under cover of darkness allowed Boaz to refuse Ruth without publicly humiliating her or damaging her already low marriage prospects. And Ruth scrupulously follows Naomi's instructions. She watches, she waits in the darkness, she's careful to make sure that nobody can see her, that nothing untoward is happening. And when all is quiet, except for the occasional snore, she makes her way stealthily to where Boaz is sleeping. And as Naomi instructed, Ruth uncovers his feet and lies down next to them. And you might be wondering why Boaz woke from his sleep. Well, he felt the cold air on his feet. He felt the cold air. He wakes up because of that, and he's startled to find a woman lying beside his feet. "Who are you?" he asks. "I am your servant, Ruth," she says. Now, so far, everything has gone according to Naomi's plan. All Ruth needs to do now, she's managed to get where she needs to be. She's done everything that Naomi instructed her to do. Everything has gone well. Nobody has seen her. All she has to do now is wait. Wait for Boaz's response. He'll know the message. He'll get the message that is being communicated. And he'll either accept her marriage proposal or he'll gently refuse her. But instead of waiting for Boaz to respond as Naomi instructed, Ruth risks everything. She risks everything. And at the last moment, she tosses Naomi's script away and follows her own. They call it flipping the script. She flips the script. Now, this morning, after quoting President Franklin D. Roosevelt, I said that Jesus descended from immigrants and revolutionists. Those are the words that Roosevelt used. Well, it's at Boaz's threshing floor that we see glimpses of Ruth, the revolutionist, or Ruth the revolutionary. It's here that we see her challenging the status quo and advocating for change. Instead of waiting for Boaz to tell her what to do as Naomi instructed, she tells him. She tells him. "Spread the corner of your garment over me," she says. "Spread the corner of your garment over me, since you are a guardian redeemer of our family." You are a guardian redeemer of our family. Now, Naomi sent Ruth to that threshing floor in the hope that Boaz would rescue her from a life of childless poverty. But in a surprising twist, Ruth jeopardizes her own future happiness by raising the stakes. Not to benefit herself, but to benefit Naomi. And it's all for the sake of Naomi. Ruth is there to rescue her father-in-law's legacy and restore to Naomi what once belonged to her dead husband, Elimelech. Remember, widows had absolutely no legal rights, no property rights whatsoever. That's why widows were one of the most marginalized people groups in Israelite society. That's why God gave laws and encouraged the Israelites to look after them, to also look after the orphans, the poor, to look after the sojourners, the people who were traveling through. Now, when Ruth tells Boaz to spread the corner of his garment over her, she clearly states the reason why he should do this. He should do it because he is a guardian redeemer of Naomi's family. Now, not only was Ruth using legal terminology, she was actually conflating, mixing up two different, they're similar in some ways, but two different Mosaic laws. And both these laws concerned rescuing men from shame and dishonor. Rescuing men from shame and dishonor. It's a young, childless, immigrant woman who has no legal rights, who is here concerned. She's doing this because she is concerned about her father-in-law's, her dead father-in-law's shame and dishonor, and wants him restored. It's incredible. The kinsman redeemer law required a man's nearest male relative to purchase his land if he was forced to sell. It allowed for a man to buy his land back, and it prevented its permanent loss from a family. But the levirate law came into play if a man died without a male heir, which of course had happened to Elimelech. His sons lived for a while, then they died, no male heir. It required his brother by birth to marry his widow. Brother by birth to marry his widow. And the firstborn son from that marriage became the deceased man's legal heir. And they continued his line on the family tree. They received all the inheritance rights. They inherited the dead man's estate. So Ruth combines the kinsman redeemer and levirate laws and asks Boaz to obey them. But there's a very significant problem here. Neither of these laws actually apply to him. Neither of these laws apply to Boaz. Boaz is neither Elimelech's nearest male relative nor his brother by birth. There is absolutely no obligation whatsoever for him to obey either law, let alone one of them. Boaz was beyond the reach of the letter of the law, but not its spirit. Ruth's revolutionary proposal looked beyond outward compliance to the letter of the law to its heart, to its spirit, to the compassion that lay behind those laws. And generations later, many generations later, as we've seen from Mike's reading of Matthew's genealogy of Jesus, Generations later, Ruth's descendant, Jesus, would interpret the law in much the same way during his Sermon on the Mount. Now, Ruth was hoping that Boaz's response would be rooted in compassion. She wasn't looking for a husband to protect and provide for her. She was volunteering to bear a son who would restore and continue the family line of Naomi's dead husband Elimelech. And Boaz is awestruck. He's awestruck by Ruth's hesed, her profound love for Naomi, her willingness to sacrifice her own interests for someone else. And he recognizes Ruth for who she is. He doesn't look at her and think, oh, Moabites are our enemies. Oh, and she's childless. I wonder what happened to her husband. Probably went off with someone else. None of these things are going through his head. He looks at her and he sees a woman of great substance, of great character. In fact, he praises her noble character. And Boaz tells her that there's someone more closely related to Elimelech who must be given first refusal on whether or not to act as the family's guardian redeemer. If they are unwilling to do so, he vows to do it instead. And Ruth returns to Naomi, and they marvel together at what's transpired during that evening. And the next day, Boaz sets out to fulfill Ruth's proposal. However, there's a significant obstacle he needs to overcome. He has to find a way to convince Naomi's closer relative to pass up being her guardian redeemer so he can step in and fulfill that role. Boaz assembles the local leaders at the town gate, the place where all legal matters were settled in Bethlehem. And there, he presents Naomi's case. Inspired, I think, by Ruth's revolutionary spirit, Boaz ignores the letter of the law. And he insists that Naomi has property rights, when she doesn't, and that purchasing her land, which doesn't actually belong to her legally, purchasing her land is an urgent matter. Then, taking his lead from Ruth, he suggests that if the nearer guardian redeemer wishes to buy Naomi's land, he must also fulfill levirate law. So, in other words, he will have to marry Ruth. And what seemed at first to be a lucrative investment for Naomi's closer relatives suddenly becomes a bit much. It becomes a high-stakes gamble he's not willing to take. And he ends up telling Boaz, she's all yours. She's all yours, mate. You can be the guardian redeemer in my place. And Boaz manages to push through everything Ruth proposed and have it ratified legally by the town elders. Inspired by Ruth, he presented a radical reinterpretation of the law and got away with it. And no one opposed him. No one opposed him. Why was this? Why was this? How did he get away with this? Why didn't someone point out, well, hang on a minute. I don't think you really read the letter of the law. You don't think you really know what the letter of the law says there. No one opposed him. No comeback whatsoever. The reason, the answer is found in the short genealogy at the very end of the story, at the very end of the 4th chapter. And this reveals that Boaz belonged to a very prominent family in the leading tribe of Judah. His grandfather, Nahshon, was the commanding general of the tribe of Judah. He was the 3rd man in rank next to Moses and Aaron. Moses, Aaron, Nahshon. Nahshon, that was Boaz's grandfather. So Boaz was a highly respected man with considerable, by the standards of the day, considerable power and influence. But rather than abuse his power and influence for personal gain, he uses it to advance the cause of 2 destitute widows. And at the seat of Bethlehem's government, Boaz gives Naomi and Ruth a legal voice. He gives them a voice they didn't have before. And he intercedes on their behalf. He steps in on their behalf. And generations later, Boaz's descendant, Jesus, is interceding on our behalf at the very highest seat of government, the right hand of God. And Boaz marries Ruth, and they have a son called Obed. And the story concludes with the widow who lost her husband and both sons cradling baby Obed in her arms, looking at him as if he were her own. And Naomi's neighbors, they're there and they're rejoicing with her, and they say, now at last Naomi has a son again. And the birth of Obed marks a new beginning for Naomi. She will help raise the man who will become the grandfather of King David. From Naomi, Obed will learn about God's love, God's hesed. He'll learn that God's steadfast loving kindness never ends. And Obed will pass on what he learns from Naomi to his son, Jesse, who will eventually pass it on to his son, David, who will express it throughout the Psalms that he writes, with lines such as, surely your goodness and hesed, your love will follow me all the days of my life. The birth of Obed marks a new beginning for Boaz. He will impart his wisdom to the man who will become the grandfather of King David. And from Boaz, Obed will learn how to wield power with restraint, how to use it responsibly for the benefit of others. And Obed will pass on what he learns from Boaz to his son, Jesse, who will eventually pass it on to David, whose restraint and conscientious use of power will determine the future of an entire nation. Twice, David will stay his hand and will refuse to cut the throat of his murderous father-in-law Saul. And whilst hiding in a cave, David will resist the temptation to abuse his authority. Instead of drinking fresh, cool water brought to him from the well in Bethlehem, his hometown, he'll be horrified that his men risked their lives to get it. And he'll pour it out onto the floor, onto the ground, out of respect for those men who risked their lives. The birth of Obed marks a new beginning for Ruth. As Obed grows up and watches his birth mother, he will see faith in action. He will see how faith in God inspires courage and boldness. And Obed's grandson, David, will exercise that same faith. He'll exercise that same faith when he walks into the valley of Elah as a young shepherd boy and faces the Philistine giant, Goliath. Both Naomi and his birth parents help to shape Obed into the man he becomes. And their godly influence continues down the generations and helps to make David into the man he becomes, a man after God's own heart. A man who will become king in Israel and will establish a royal line that will culminate with Jesus, the Messiah. Amen.